Okay, hey YouTube, we are live. Today we are going to be discussing the factors that play into the different scores you will receive from an IQ test. And today we're going to be refuting some of the main arguments that racialists use to justify their beliefs that racial IQ gaps between groups is due to genetics, genotype genetics in particular. Okay, you can go ahead and start whenever you want to, Jessica.
Well, first of all, I'd like to kind of deconstruct the very basis of their agenda. They call themselves hereditarians, and the reason they've chosen that title is because heritability figures are essential to their argument that IQ scores are purely genetic. As we know, IQ is highly heritable, though many people are fearful of confirming this because they think that believing that is the equivalent of conceding defeat. And I want to explain why it's not. Now, hereditarianism is not exclusive to the race and intelligence conversation. It spans across many controversial topics, non-controversial topics even, and its proponents heavily overlap with those of biological determinism. In fact, I'd even venture to say that they verge on being identical, or at least highly similar narratives. Now, the misuse of heritability is very prevalent, not just within these circles, but within the scientific community as a whole. I've seen firsthand that even people who you'd assume would know better often have such an astonishingly poor grasp of what heritability entails and what information it can and cannot provide.
Sounds
Well,
like Sam Harris.
yeah. Well-meaning people, liberal academics, they misunderstand it all the time as well. It's frighteningly pervasive. Whether this stems from a weak background in population statistics, I don't know, but it's definitely very common. And as a result, there's this very prevalent idea that heritability measures how genetically determined a trait is, when in actuality, what it measures is the ratio of environmental to genetic influence on variance within a defined group. It can't be used across different populations like whites and blacks because the environments are too different. And it's not a fixed value. Heritability estimates are entirely determined by the degree of environmental influence. For example, height in Australia, the heritability of height in Australia is different from the heritability of height in China because in China there's more income inequality. So heritability is automatically lower because of the environmental variance. So it's not calculated by the effect of genes or anything. It's a ratio that is completely determined by the degree of environmental influence.
Yeah, it's kind of like, for instance, like when people ask the question, like, why in general, like, do a lot of black people, why are they generally taller, more muscular, and why do a lot of them, for instance, have slightly bigger noses and lips? Well, if you're in Africa, I mean, you're gonna have to suck in more oxygen to cool your body down. So over
Mm-hmm.
time, your nose and your mouth is going to be a lot bigger. And when you're talking about athleticism, basically based on speed, of course you're going to have to be fast because you're growing up in an environment where you're basically running from the fastest beast and animals in the world. So based off natural selection, the
Yeah,
humans who are able to run faster
definitely.
will be able to produce. Whereas when you're in Europe, you're not going to need to suck in as much oxygen because you're in a colder environment.
Yeah, in fact, you need to keep out the cold. So,
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, you have a point. But go on.
and that's a really good point that you brought up because those are all very plausible evolutionary mechanisms. Whereas for intelligence differences between whites and blacks, there aren't any plausible evolutionary mechanisms because intelligence is highly selective for across all continents. It's a requirement for human beings to survive on any continent because compared to wild animals, we are completely unequipped to defend ourselves, and intelligence is the main thing that we have to protect ourselves from predators. So it makes no sense for intelligence to be less selective for in Africa, one of the most dangerous continents on the planet.
Yeah, and I want to know something. This is what baffles me about these racialists, what they call themselves, racial realists. When they're doing these IQ scores, have they ever looked at the data that shows that even when you look at Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans, that there's a huge disparity between these two groups, and they're all white? Do they even look at that data?
Some of them do, and some of them don't. It depends on exactly um, how restrictive their definitions of white are. Some of them think that white people are only blondes with blue eyes. So
I get your point with that. I get your point with that.
yeah, and
Now,
actually, in the past, I had read about a study done around it's the early 20th century, and it was studying the differences between East and West Germans, and there was a huge IQ disparity between them, despite no ethnicity differences whatsoever. They're the same people, but completely different lifestyles, completely different politics and culture, and there was a huge intelligence difference between them in the same region.
and was those so was there by any chance were the disparities due to like poverty or lack of education around those
Yes,
particular areas?
exactly.
Okay. And when we talk about like what are some of the like main factors in your opinion that could contribute to someone having a much lower IQ than another person? Like what are some extreme factors?
Well, I would venture as to say that all variation within the normal range, which is 85 to 105, is environmentally influenced most of the time. Like IQ tests are very useful for telling us about extremes, like detecting learning disabilities or gifted individuals. But it gets fuzzier when we're talking about people within the normal range because that's where environment plays a main part. So while you can't necessarily argue that environment is going to turn a genius into someone with a learning disability because it's not. You can definitely argue that environment is the difference between, say, the average Asian IQ score and the average Black IQ score. And this is controversial to a lot of people, but I have concluded, based on my own personal research, that culture does play a main role, and that's the approach to education, not necessarily one community valuing education less, but the approach to education. You will find that in Asian and immigrant communities, the approach to education is much more vigorous than both blacks and whites.
Yeah, and I mean, even when you go into places like China, for example, I know that based off this the statistics that I've seen, China, North Korea, and some of those Asian countries, especially the more I say Eastern Asian countries than the South and
Mm-hmm.
Southeast Asian countries, because I know the South and Southeast they have a lot more corruption and a lot more problems compared to the other ones. But I
Yeah,
do,
and
yeah, go ahead. I'm
their
sorry.
their approach to education is also completely different in those countries. They don't have quite the same cultural practices as have stemmed from Confucianist China.
Yeah, and I know like within China, I mean, even when you're talking about the IQs, there's even IQ diversity within the China region because I know
Mm-hmm.
in like generally speaking, like people like if you were to compare rural people to people in the city are gonna have much higher IQs. And even same thing out there in China, when you look at the IQ differences, you see that the people who have the much lower IQs are in rural America, like are in rural countries. But I do know
Mm-hmm.
that like people, especially on the right political spectrum, I don't know, they tend to use not just Asian Americans, but also like African immigrants, because statistically speaking, African immigrants are the most educated group, like the Nigerians are the most educated group in this country, but they never take in consideration like what how those immigrants were prior to arriving here to America. Like
Yeah.
yeah, like if you look at African immigrants in particular, like Nigerian Americans, I mean they are pretty educated. They're a really educated group here. But I mean, I was reading articles that a lot of people in Nigeria are locked out of even receiving a proper education, and that the majority of the population still is overall illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I've constantly said that environmental factors and culture does play a key role. And when I say culture, I really focus more on like family culture, because
Yeah.
culture, yeah, because culture among certain like African Americans, our cultures are very diverse, whether people believe it or not.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, what else I was going to ask you? So, what are some other arguments that racialists use to justify their claims outside of her, I don't know, intelligence being hereditary?
Um, Another main argument I would say that I've seen being made a lot is that because I think I touched on this a bit last time, but I would like to go into more detail this time
Okay.
because in these intervention studies with Black children, the gains that they make, such as in the Head Start program, for example, tend to not last at all. And the reasoning I gave for this the last time was as a result of synaptic pruning, which is when the brain loses synapses over time because they're not being used anymore. And we can see that happening when the children return to their original environments, and several years later, the IQ gains and the academic progress have both been entirely wiped out. And a lot of racialists will say this is because they are falling back to their genetic potential, and they don't really give a mechanism or explanation for this at all. And that's because, quite frankly, it is nonsense. And anyone who has studied the development of the human brain over the first 20 years of the human lifespan will tell you that there are many reasons why someone's academic capability could change over several years and be permanently affected.
I mean, have they? I mean, have they ever just? I mean, have they ever just looked at the fact that in a lot of black neighborhoods, particularly in the inner city, I mean, you have a lot of broken. Well, you have a lot of broken homes, and when it comes to poverty in general, but especially in the inner city, a lot of broken homes, lower property taxes, so it's much harder to fund public schools. I mean, have they? It seems to me that a lot of these racialists, it's like they're cherry picking a lot of their information, but they're not looking at the much bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of their information is also completely made up, like what I just told you about falling back to genetic potential. And I don't think it's intentionally completely made up, although it may be. It is, again, stemming from the misunderstanding of heritability, because you see that heritability rises over time. And a lot of people think, oh, that means the trait is getting more genetic, which is not entirely true.
Okay, so it's basically what they call pseudoscience. I,
Yes, yes, pseudoscience.
I'm sorry, pseudos. I don't know. I get it mixed up a a whole bunch. And if there's another thing that I wanted you to touch on with me, because I've studied the arguments of I've read a little bit into race and intelligence, but I never really got to the deep origins. What were the origins of this IQ test really? When people start bringing up the bell curve and those types of things, like where did they get this phenomena from?
Well, the creator of the IQ test actually himself said that he did not think that the IQ test should be used to compare races. And he was very accurate in having those concerns because of how useless heritability is when you're trying to measure it across vastly different groups, which is why heritability needs to be focused on one specifically defined population. Like it can be used within the Black community, or it can be used within the white community, or it can be used in the poor or the rich, but you should never cross those groups because that's going to muddle the results and it won't make any sense. It will be completely useless as a population figure.
Okay, okay. Well, I think we've pretty much so touched on a lot of the the racial and intelligence controversy. Did you ever get a chance to read that study that I sent you last night?
Yes, yes, I did.
Yeah, what did you, in your personal opinion? Because I'll be honest with you, I read some of it, but I didn't have a chance to read the whole piece. But from what I basically gained from what I've read is that I guess black boys, even in wealthier families, have a higher chance of dropping into poverty or not climbing the economic ladder compared to a white middle class man or a rich white male. Then they also said that Black American women, based off this particular study, it's much easier for them to climb the economic ladder. So, in your opinion, like, what was your takeaway from the article?
My takeaway was that Black communities in general have less wealth built up. So even if one part of the family has made it, that doesn't mean the rest of the family has made it. So there's less resources to go around, and when someone becomes an adult, they're more or less on their own, at least in the Black community. Whereas a white person may have wealth going back generations and generations, and so many people that can help them out, so much money to go around.
Yeah, and I mean, if you don't know something like I'm personally, I'm neither a Republican or Democrat. I don't classify myself as being left or right. I just don't. I have my own personal views on that, but I do feel that, and I don't know your political views either, or what side of the political spectrum
An
you're.
independent.
Yeah, but I mean, my problem with the left in particular is that over the past couple decades, it seems to me that they've been using this term or this narrative over the years, which is it's not about class, it's about race. Which, in my personal opinion, they're both on the same coin, but there's two different sides to it. I mean, even when you
Yeah.
go in, and this was a very extensive study, but I mean, this other guy a long time ago, and I believe he was at Princeton. He was a white economist, I believe. I believe he was a white economist. He showed that even when you take into account advanced degrees within the same study, like within a group of people or two people who have studied the same type of degree, he found out that overall Black Americans still had higher unemployment rates, particularly Black men. He also found out that they still get paid less. And then when you look at Black women, for example, based off when you include race and gender, Black American women are the most educated group in America. That's a fact. The most educated group when you include race and gender, but yet their unemployment rates are higher than white women, and they get paid less than white women, including if they work the same job. And I know a lot. I was watching a couple videos last night, and I kept hearing a lot of people say, that the solution to the whole problems facing the Black communities, particularly in the inner city, is just investing in education and investing in education. Well, if you ask me, over the course of the years, and there's studies proving that there are more Black college graduates now than there's ever been, we're still pretty much so in a hole. And I feel the reason why we're really in a hole is because it's hurtful for me to say this, but race really matters. And there
Yeah, it does.
yeah, and people don't want to talk about it, but there is a racial hierarchy of preference that exists. And
And
I feel that we kind of miss the mark in this country when we sit here and say, if we just eliminate the disparities in wealth between classes, we'll eliminate the disparity between races, and that's just not how it works.
yes, it's much, much more complicated and complex than that. And I do think that liberal academics have definitely dropped the ball in allowing this subject to be completely dominated by racialists and failing to make extensive arguments because they feel that it doesn't deserve a refutation.
Do you? I mean, what do you? In your personal opinion, because I know I'm setting up another hangout over the weekend with another guy who really studies this stuff extensively himself. I mean, what really are the solutions to that problem? Because I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't want to consider myself to be a pessimistic person. I try to be as
Mm-hmm.
optimistic as I can, but with the way our current government is set up in this country, I don't know what can really fix that problem. I really don't.
Um, I would say that the IQ gap will eventually, I believe, begin to narrow again. Whether or not it'll close completely, I can't say. But there definitely is hope. But it would definitely take several different changes in different areas for it to close. Changes in cultural attitudes, changes in the accessibility of education, changes in socioeconomic status overall in the community, less people living in these disadvantaged communities, less poorly supplied schools, And I actually think that that would result in changes in cultural attitudes as well. It would motivate people more.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Well, it looks like we pretty much you basically summed up in two videos, you summed up the origins of race and intelligence controversy, and you refuted all their points perfectly. Is there anything else you would like to add, Jessica?
Um, I guess I would just like to add that the evidence that cultural attitudes have such a heavy influence on IQ scores is it's very solid. For instance, there's been a study where traditionally adopted Black children and transracially adopted Black children, there's a 13-point difference in scores between them.
Okay, okay, okay. Well, Jessica, that's it for today. I thank you again for joining us.
All right, yes, I've enjoyed it very much.
Okay, hit
Thank
you
you
up
for
later.
having me on.
Bye. Bye.